The air in that Lenox Avenue basement was thick enough to choke on. Cigarette smoke, bootleg whiskey, and something else. Fear. The kind that seeps through concrete walls and settles in your bones. Frank Lucas stood there, 32 years old, sharp as a switchblade in his tailored suit, watching the man across from him sweat through silk. The overhead bulb swung lazy circles, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the poker table between them. 3 stacks of cash, 2 empty. Chairs. One question hanging in the air like a noose. Who moves first? You could hear everything in that silence. The drip of water from a rusted pipe, the muffled bass of Miles Davis bleeding through the floorboards from the club upstairs. Frank's own heartbeat, steady, controlled, the rhythm of a man who'd learned patience from the best. But there was something wrong with the picture. The other man, let's call him what he was, a problem, kept glancing at the door. Not the way you look when you're planning to leave, the way you look when you're waiting for someone to arrive. His fingers drummed the table, Morse code for I made a mistake. Frank had seen this dance before. Hell, he'd learned this dance. Every twitch, every tell, every micro-expression that separates the players from the played. And right now, watching this fool unravel in real time, Frank remembered something Bumpy Johnson had said to him 3 weeks ago. Something he'd laughed off as old man paranoia. Growth ain't the same as control, young blood. And the second you forget that, the game forgets you. Frank had smiled, nodded, walked away thinking the old man was slipping. Now, in this basement, with the weight of Harlem pressing down through 6 floors of tenement dreams and broken promises, Frank Lucas was starting to understand that Bumpy Johnson had never said anything by accident in his entire life. The problem across the table cleared his throat. Frank, listen. Nah. Frank's voice came out smooth, almost gentle. That's how you knew it was dangerous. You had your time to talk. Used it all up running your mouth to people who don't give a damn about you. Now it's my turn. The man's hand moved toward his waistband. Not fast, not slow. Just inevitable, like watching a car crash in a dream where you can't quite wake up. Frank didn't flinch, didn't reach for his own piece. He just tilted his head, curious, the way a scientist watches a lab rat make the wrong turn in a maze. Go ahead, Frank said. But before you do, let me ask you something. The hand stopped, hovering, trembling. You ever wonder why Bumpy never had to pull his gun? Not once in 20 years? The question hung there, heavier than the smoke, heavier than the silence, heavier than the decision being made in that fraction of a second. And then Frank smiled, not with his mouth, with his eyes, the kind of smile that says, I know something you don't. It's because by the time he wanted you gone, you were already dead. You just hadn't figured it out yet. The man's hand moved. Metal cleared leather. The click of a hammer being pulled back echoed like a judge's gavel in that concrete tomb. Frank didn't move, didn't need to, because what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen next, would become legend in Harlem. The kind of story told in whispers, passed down like scripture, until nobody could quite remember if it was true or just another ghost story. From the streets that never sleep. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Would you have let that gun clear the holster? Would you have bet your life on a lesson learned 3 weeks too late? Subscribe and stay with me, because what Frank Lucas learned in that basement changed Harlem forever. And if you think you know how this ends, you don't. Trust me, you really don't. Let's rewind. 3 weeks before that basement became a tomb, Harlem, summer of 1968. The streets smelled like possibility, and danger in equal measure. Hot asphalt, soul food from corner joints, and underneath it all, the copper tang of blood that never quite washed away. This was the Harlem that existed between the headlines, where power wasn't measured in votes or laws, but in respect, fear, and the ability to make problems disappear. Bumpy Johnson was the king of that invisible kingdom, not because he was the loudest, not because he was the meanest, but because he understood something that most men spend their whole lives missing: real power whispers. Frank Lucas had been watching Bumpy for 15 years by then, not just watching, studying, the way a pianist studies Mozart or a boxer studies Ali. He'd memorized every gesture, every pause, every decision made in the spaces between words. How Bumpy would let a man talk himself into a grave without ever raising his voice. How he'd solve a problem 3 months before it became a problem. How he commanded loyalty not through fear, but through understanding that everyone has something they can't afford to lose. Frank thought he'd cracked the code. absorbed the manual, graduated with honors from the Bumpy Johnson School of Street Wisdom. He was wrong. See, Bumpy had been sick for months. Not the kind of sick that shows. The kind that settles in your bones and reminds you that time comes for kings and peasants just the same. Harlem could feel it, the way you feel a storm before it hits, the way the air gets heavy and everything goes quiet except for the birds flying the wrong direction. And in that quiet, Frank saw his moment. He was young, relatively speaking, sharp, hungry in a way that Bumpy hadn't been in decades. The old rules seemed like anchors dragging everyone down while the world spun faster and faster around them. The Italians were expanding, the cops were getting greedier, the game was changing, and Frank Lucas believed he was the future of Harlem. So he started making moves. Not against Bumpy. Frank wasn't stupid, but around him. Building connections, cutting deals, speaking when Bumpy would have stayed silent, taking risks that made his pulse race and his pockets swell. Every day felt like winning. Every week brought new territory, new respect, new proof that he'd learned from the best and was ready to become the best. The streets started talking. Frank Lucas is up next. Frank Lucas is the real deal. Frank Lucas learned from Bumpy and made it better. That's when Bumpy called him in. It was a Tuesday. Frank remembered because Tuesdays were for collections and he'd pulled in more money that week than some bosses made in a month. He walked into Bumpy's spot on 133rd Street feeling like a heavyweight champion. Chest out, confidence radiating off him like heat from summer concrete. Bumpy was sitting in his usual chair, the leather one that had molded to his frame over 20 years of decisions. He looked smaller than usual, older, the kind of old that happens overnight, when mortality stops being a concept and becomes a countdown. But his eyes were still sharp, still seeing everything. "Sit down, Frank." Frank sat, poured himself a drink from the decanter on the side table, Tennessee whiskey, the expensive kind, and waited for whatever wisdom Bumpy was about to drop. Maybe congratulations on the week's take. Maybe advice on the Italian situation brewing over in East Harlem. Maybe, "You're moving too fast." Frank stopped mid-sip, set the glass down slow. "Come again?" "You heard me." Bumpy's voice had no anger in it, no disappointment, just fact, delivered the way you'd tell someone it's raining outside. "You're expanding too quick, talking too much, trusting too easy, making yourself visible when you should be invisible." "Bumpy, with all respect." Frank leaned forward, hands spread, reasonable. "The game's different now. You gotta move fast or you get left behind. The Italians ain't playing by yesterday's rules. And you think I don't see that?" Bumpy didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The question landed like a slap. "I'm building something here," Frank said, hearing the defensiveness creep into his tone and hating it. "Taking what you taught me and missing the most important lesson." Bumpy cut him off. "Not harsh, just final. Don't confuse growth with control, young blood. They ain't the same thing. And the second you forget that, the game forgets you." The words hung there. Frank heard them, processed them, and then he smiled. Inside, where Bumpy couldn't see it, Frank Lucas was laughing, because in that moment, all he heard was fear, nostalgia, an old king clinging to his throne while the world changed around him. Bumpy Johnson was slipping, getting soft, letting age cloud his vision. Frank stood up, nodded respectfully, said all the right things, and walked out thinking the old man had finally lost his edge. "So here's my question for you. Do you think money and ambition are enough to break 15 years of brotherhood? Or was Frank right to trust his own instinct over Bumpy's warning? Drop your thoughts in the comments because what happens next proves that sometimes the quietest warnings are the loudest threats. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, not through the mail, not delivered by hand to Frank's front door like some amateur operation. No, this came the way serious money always comes. Quiet, indirect, with enough layers between the source and the delivery that nobody could ever prove who sent it. A kid, maybe 12, walked up to Frank outside the Red Rooster on Lenox, handed him a brown paper package, said, "Man on Morningside told me to give you this," and disappeared into the crowd before Frank could ask which man, which part of Morningside, or anything else that might have mattered. Inside the package, 20 crisp $100 bills and a phone number. No note, no explanation, just money and a number. Frank stood there on the sidewalk, Harlem flowing around him like a river around a stone, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, the dangerous kind, The kind that makes smart men do dumb things because they convince themselves they're too smart to fall for whatever trap is being set. He called the number from a payphone 3 blocks away, dropped a dime, listened to it ring twice, heard a voice like gravel poured over ice. "Mr. Lucas, glad you could find time in your busy schedule." Italian accent. Not heavy, just enough to tell you this man's grandfather didn't speak English at home. Professional. The kind of voice that signs death warrants between bites of veal parmesan. "You got 60 seconds, Frank said, "and it better be good, considering you're paying $2,000 for a phone call. That's not payment. That's a gesture of respect. The payment comes when you hear what we're offering. I'm listening. You're expanding. We're expanding. Harlem's a big place, but not big enough for all of us to eat unless we figure out how to share the table. Mr. Johnson, God bless him, may he have many more years, understands this, but he's traditional, set in his ways. We need someone with vision, someone who understands that the future of this business isn't about territories and old grudges. It's about cooperation, efficiency, maximum profit with minimum bloodshed." Frank said nothing. Let the silence work for him the way Bumpy had taught him. The voice continued. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000 cash untraceable, plus protection from certain complications that tend to arise when enterprising young men challenge the established order. All we need from you is information. Nothing that hurts anyone, just awareness. Who's shipping what? Who's meeting with whom? The kind of intelligence that helps everyone avoid unnecessary conflict. You're asking me to spy on Bumpy. Johnson, we're asking you to be pragmatic. Bumpy's a great man, a legend, but legends belong to the past, Mr. Lucas. You belong to the future. The question is, do you want to wait for that future to arrive naturally, or do you want to accelerate the process?" The line went dead. Frank stood in that phone booth, glass covered in scratches and graffiti, someone's initials carved deep enough to last forever, and felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders like a wool coat in August. $50,000. He did the math in his head. That was 2 years' worth of careful hustling. That was a house upstate. That was enough guns to arm a small militia. That was legitimate money, the kind you could wash clean and turn into something that would outlast your name on these streets. But more than the money, more than the cash itself, was what it represented. Validation. The Italians saw him as a peer, an equal, someone worth investing in. They weren't making this offer to Bumpy's other lieutenants, not to Red John or Sugar Ray or any of the old heads who'd been around since before Frank learned to drive. They came to him because they recognized that Frank Lucas wasn't just Bumpy's shadow anymore. He was his own man, his own force. He walked back to his apartment, third-floor walk-up on 142nd, nice enough to impress but not nice enough to attract attention, and spread those 20 hundreds across his kitchen table. Crisp, sequential, the kind of new money that still smells like ink and possibility. Frank poured himself a drink, sat there staring at those bills like they were tea leaves that might tell his future. Here's what he told himself. This isn't betrayal. This is survival. Bumpy's sick. The Italians are moving in whether we cooperate or not. If I don't take this deal, someone else will. And isn't it better that someone from Harlem has influence in those rooms, rather than letting outsiders carve us up without any voice? At all? That's how it always starts. Not with malice, not with greed, with justification, with a story you tell yourself until it sounds true enough to believe. Frank made the call 3 days later, gave them one piece of information. Small. Nothing that would hurt anyone, he told himself. Just a shipment date, a docking schedule, something the Italians could have found out anyway with enough effort. The payment arrived the next morning, $50,000 in a duffel bag, delivered to a storage unit Frank kept for emergencies. He opened it, saw more money than his father had made in his entire life, and felt, not guilt, power. He was playing both sides now, taking Bumpy's lessons and applying them to a bigger game, expanding his vision beyond Harlem's borders, thinking strategically instead of emotionally. Or at least, that's the story he told himself every night, when the silence got too loud, and his reflection in the mirror started asking questions he didn't want to answer. What Frank didn't know, what he couldn't know because he was too busy congratulating himself on his genius, was that information moves through Harlem like water through soil, invisible, inevitable, and someone was already tracking every drop. So let me ask you this. In a world where everyone's playing dirty, where the rules are written by whoever's strong enough to enforce them. Who's the real villain here? The Italians trying to expand their empire? Frank Lucas trying to secure his future? Or Bumpy Johnson for building a system that made this conflict inevitable? Tell me your thoughts, because the answer isn't as simple as you might think. Bumpy Johnson learned he'd been betrayed on a Monday morning. Over breakfast. Poached eggs and wheat toast. The newspaper spread across his table like a map of a world he'd spent 40 years trying to control. The man who told him was named Raymond. Raymond Quick Fingers Thompson, who'd been running numbers for Bumpy since Truman was president. Quick Fingers wasn't fast anymore. Arthritis had settled into his knuckles like an unwelcome houseguest, but he still saw everything, heard everything, knew which whispers mattered, and which ones were just wind. "Bumpy," Quick Fingers said, sitting down without being invited because they'd known each other long enough that formalities were optional. "We got a problem." Bumpy set down his coffee. "Just one? Must be a good week. Frank's been talking to the Corsinis." The words landed soft. Didn't need volume to hit hard. Bumpy showed nothing. No anger. No surprise. No disappointment. He just nodded slow, the way you nod when someone confirms something you already suspected. "How long? Week? Maybe 2. Started after you called him in for that talk. And what's he giving them? Information. Nothing major yet. Schedules, movements. Who's got beef with who? Testing the waters, seems like." But Bumpy, Quick Fingers leaned forward, voice dropping even though they were alone. "If he's talking to them at all, you know where that road ends." Bumpy sat back in his chair, picked up his coffee again, took a sip like they were discussing the weather instead of treachery that could get everyone in the room killed. "What do you want me to do?" Quick Fingers asked. "Here's where most men would have made their first mistake. When you find out someone's betrayed you, the instinct, the hunger, is to act immediately. Show strength. Make an example. Remind everyone watching that loyalty isn't negotiable." But Bumpy Johnson hadn't stayed alive by following instincts. He'd survived by thinking 3 months ahead of everyone else in the room. "Nothing," Bumpy said. Quick Fingers blinked. "Come again?" "I said nothing. Frank keeps doing what he's doing. You keep watching what you're watching. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. Nobody even looks at Frank Lucas wrong until I say otherwise. Bumpy, with all respect, Raymond. One word. Quiet. Final." Quick Fingers shut his mouth. "I taught that boy everything he knows," Bumpy continued, voice soft as Sunday morning, "which means I know exactly what he's thinking right now, knows exactly how he's gonna move. See? Frank's problem ain't that he's disloyal. Disloyalty I can work with. Frank's problem is that he thinks he's smarter than he is, thinks he absorbed all my lessons and graduated. But he missed the most important one." "What's that?" Bumpy smiled. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile a chess master makes when his opponent doesn't realize they've already lost. "That everything I taught him, every move, every strategy, every trick, I can use against him better than he can use for himself. Because I didn't just teach him what to do, I taught him how to think, which means I can predict his next 10 moves before he makes his first one." Over the next 2 weeks, Bumpy Johnson orchestrated a masterclass in psychological warfare. He didn't confront Frank, didn't freeze him out, didn't do anything that would suggest he knew what was happening. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He let Frank keep winning. Every deal Frank touched turned gold. Every connection he made paid off. Every risk he took seemed to validate his genius. The Italians kept paying. Bumpy kept smiling. And Frank Lucas started believing his own hype. But underneath that surface, invisible to everyone except the people who'd been playing this game longer than Frank had been alive, Bumpy was moving pieces. A conversation here, a favor there, a quiet word with someone who owed someone who knew someone. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable, just small adjustments, like turning a dial 1 degree at a time until suddenly the whole frequency changes. He let information slip to the Italians. Not the truth, something better than truth. Information that sounded true, felt true, but would lead them exactly where Bumpy wanted them to go. He planted doubt in Frank's inner circle, not accusations. Doubt is more subtle than that. Just questions, observations. Frank sure has been lucky lately, hasn't he? Almost like someone's making sure his plays work out. He adjusted the temperature of the streets degree by degree, until everyone could feel something building, but nobody could quite say what. And through it all, Bumpy watched, patient, unmovable as a mountain while everyone else scrambled around thinking they were in control. "You know what's going to kill Frank?" Bumpy said to Quick Fingers one night, sharing a bottle of cognac older than most of the players in this game. "Won't be the Italians. Won't be me. Won't even be bad luck." "Then what?" "His own arrogance, see? Frank thinks I didn't see this coming. Thinks I'm old and slow and stuck in yesterday while he's out here building tomorrow. But I saw this move 3 years ago, back when he first started. Getting that hungry look in his eyes. That I can do it better look. I saw it coming, and instead of stopping it," Bumpy paused, poured another drink. "I let it happen, because sometimes the best way to teach someone a lesson is to let them learn it themselves. The hard way. That's cold, Bumpy." "Nah." Bumpy's voice went soft, almost sad. "That's love. Real love. The kind that hurts now but saves their life later, if they're smart enough to learn from it." 2 weeks later, Bumpy made a call. One phone call. 5 minutes of conversation. No threats. No anger. Just business. Conducted in the language men like him spoke when words meant more than bullets. By the time he hung up, 3 things were set in motion. First, the Italians learned, through channels they trusted implicitly, that Frank Lucas was playing them, feeding them information, sure, but also feeding information about them back to Bumpy, making himself invaluable to both sides, which, in the zero-sum game of street power, meant he couldn't be trusted by either side. Second, Frank's most trusted lieutenant, the man handling the money, the connections, the logistics, started noticing discrepancies, small ones at first, then larger, then large enough to suggest that someone was skimming, and the obvious suspect was the only person with access to everything. Third, the man Frank had been dealing with in the Corsini family, the smooth-talking soldier who'd made that first phone call and delivered that first envelope. That man disappeared, not killed, just transferred, sent to handle business in Philadelphia, effective immediately, replaced by someone new, someone who'd never heard of Frank Lucas and didn't give a damn about previous arrangements. All 3 dominoes set up with one phone call. Now all Bumpy had to do was wait for Frank to knock them over himself. Is Bumpy a hero for protecting his people? Quick Fingers asked him that same night. Or is he just a smarter criminal? Bumpy thought about that question for a long time, longer than Quick Fingers expected. "I'm a teacher," he finally said. "Always have been. Some lessons you can tell a man, others he's got to learn by bleeding. Frank's about to get schooled. So here's my question. Is Bumpy Johnson a hero for protecting his territory and his people from external threats? Or is he just a more sophisticated version of the same violence and manipulation he claims to rise above?" Subscribe for more untold legends, because the answer to that question reveals everything about how power really works in places where the law doesn't reach. Which brings us back to that basement, the one where Frank Lucas was learning that sometimes the most important lessons arrive with a gun pointed at your chest. Let me set the scene again, now that you know how we got here. The man across the poker table, his name was Vincent. Vincent Corso, low-level Corsini soldier, the kind of guy who'd do anything to prove himself worthy of his last name. The Corsinis had sent him to Frank with a new offer: eliminate Bumpy Johnson, permanently. In exchange, Frank would get protection, expansion rights, and a seat at the table when they carved up Harlem like Thanksgiving turkey. Frank had said yes, not because he wanted Bumpy dead, at least that's what he told himself, but because saying no would have meant admitting he'd been playing a game he couldn't win. And Frank Lucas didn't lose, couldn't lose. His entire identity was built on being the smartest man in the room, and backing down would mean accepting that he was just another lieutenant with delusions of grandeur. So he'd said yes, agreed to set up the meeting, bring Bumpy to a neutral location where Vincent and his people could handle things cleanly. Except Frank made one mistake, one tiny, insignificant mistake that seemed like nothing at the time but turned out to be everything. He told Vincent to come to the basement first, to discuss logistics, to make sure they were both on the same page before Frank stuck his neck out and potentially destroyed the only real father figure he'd ever known. And that's where we are now, in this concrete tomb that smells like death and bad decisions. Vincent's gun is out, the hammer's pulled back. Frank should be scared, should be planning his next move, calculating angles, figuring out how to survive the next 60 seconds. But he's not, because in this moment, in the space between the hammer pulling back and the trigger being pulled, Frank Lucas is experiencing something he's never felt before in his entire life. Certainty. Not the good kind. Not the kind that means you know you'll win. The bad kind. The kind that means you suddenly understand exactly how badly you've miscalculated, how far out of your depth you've swam, and how perfectly you've been manipulated into swimming there. Go ahead, Frank says again. Voice. Steady. Pull it. Vincent's hand trembles. Just slightly. Enough that both men notice. Pull it, Frank repeats. Shoot me. Right here. Right now. Because that's what you came to do, isn't it? Not talk. Not plan. You came here to tie up a loose end. The hell you talking about? The Corsinis sent you to kill me, Vincent. Not work with me, not partner up. They sent you here to eliminate a problem. And that problem is me. Vincent's face does something complicated. Tries for confusion. Almost lands on it. But there's recognition in his eyes. The kind you can't fake. You're paranoid, Vincent says. But his gun hand drops. Just an inch. Just enough. Frank smiles. It's the saddest smile you ever saw. Nah, I'm educated. See, about 5 minutes ago, standing here listening to you talk, watching you sweat through that expensive suit, I realized something. You came alone, no backup, no witnesses. You told me we were planning how to take out Bumpy, but you never once asked about his schedule, his movements, his security. You just kept pushing to make sure I was committed, make sure I'd really crossed that line. Frank takes a step forward. Vincent's gun comes back up, but there's no conviction in it now. And then I remembered something Bumpy told me once. He said, when your enemy makes your victory too easy, when every door opens and every deal works out, that's when you need to start asking who's really in control. And standing here, looking at you, I realized the door behind Vincent opens. Not dramatically, not with a crash, just opens. Casual, like someone walking into their own house. Bumpy Johnson steps into the basement. He looks smaller than he used to, frailer. The sickness has taken weight off his frame, carved lines into his face that weren't there 6 months ago. But his eyes, those eyes are still sharp enough to cut glass. Pull the trigger, Vincent, Bumpy says. Not a command, an observation. Let's see what happens. Vincent spins, gun swinging between Frank and Bumpy, trapped between two targets, neither safe, both terrifying in different ways. Mr. Johnson, Vincent manages. This isn't, I wasn't, course you weren't. Bumpy walks further in, slow, steady, hands in his pockets like he's taking a Sunday stroll. You were just following orders. The Corsinis told you to approach Frank, offer him a deal, get him to commit to betraying me, then eliminate him before he could. Either follow through or get cold feet. Clean, simple, takes care of their problem. Frank knowing too much about their operations and their competition. Me, all in one move. Vincent's gun is shaking now, swinging wild between the two men like a compass that's lost magnetic north. Here's what you don't know, Bumpy continues. Frank called me 20 minutes ago, told me where you'd be, told me what you were planning, told me everything. That's when Frank realizes he's crying. Not sobbing, not breaking down, just tears running down his face like rain on a window. Because it's not true. He didn't call Bumpy, didn't warn anyone, didn't do the right thing. But Bumpy's saying he did, giving him a gift he doesn't deserve. The gun you're holding, Bumpy says to Vincent, voice gentle as a grandmother's. Check the chamber. Vincent's face goes white. He doesn't want to check, doesn't want to confirm what he already knows. But training, years of protocol drilled into his head, makes him do it anyway. He ejects the magazine, racks the slide. Nothing. The gun is empty. I switched it this morning, Bumpy explains, while you were getting coffee on Amsterdam. Took 3 seconds. You didn't notice because you weren't looking. And you weren't looking because the Corsinis taught you to watch your target, not your weapon. Another lesson you learned wrong. Vincent drops the gun. It hits concrete with a sound like a gavel. Here's what happens next, Bumpy says. You walk out of here. Go back to your bosses. Tell them Frank Lucas is under my protection. Tell them Harlem is closed for business. Tell them if they want to expand, they can try Queens. They make a move at me or mine, and I release documentation of every shipment, every payment, every dirty cop on their payroll to the FBI, the press, and every rival family from here to Chicago. We clear? Vincent nods. Can't speak. Just nods. Then get out. Vincent runs. Literally runs. Up. The stairs through the door. Gone. Frank and Bumpy stand in that basement. Alone. The sound of Vincent's footsteps fading like thunder after a storm. You knew. Frank says. Not a question, a realization. The whole time, from the first phone call, you knew everything. Of course I knew. Bumpy sits down in one of the poker chairs. Suddenly looks every one of his 68 years. I taught you how to run a network, how to plant informants, how to make people think they're making their own choices when really they're following a script you wrote months ago. You think I wouldn't have people watching you? Protecting you even when you were too stupid to protect yourself? Why? The word comes out broken. Why let me do it? Why let me betray you? Why not just stop me before I... Because you needed to learn. Bumpy's voice is soft, almost fatherly, the way it used to be back when Frank was just a kid learning the game. You needed to feel what it's like to be played, to be manipulated, to realize that every move you thought you were making freely was actually part of someone else's plan. That's the only way you learn the difference between power and the illusion of power. Frank sits down. Legs won't hold him anymore. I could have killed you, he whispers. No. Bumpy shakes his head. You couldn't, because I made sure you couldn't. Every step of the way, I was there, invisible, making sure that when you fell, and you were always gonna fall, Frank, that was inevitable the second you decided you were smarter than me. I was there to catch you, or at least make sure you didn't hit the ground so hard you couldn't get back up. I don't understand. Yeah, you do. Bumpy stands, walks toward the door, pauses. You just don't want to, but you will, eventually. When you're my age training some hungry kid who thinks he's got the whole world figured out, you'll remember this moment, and you'll understand that the hardest part of being a king isn't winning. It's teaching the next generation how to win without destroying themselves in the process. He leaves. Frank sits there in that basement for hours, listening to Harlem through the walls, the music, the voices, the heartbeat of a neighborhood that had nearly lost one of its own because pride tastes sweet until it turns to poison. If this level of psychological warfare, this chess game played across weeks with human pieces and real consequences gave you chills if you're sitting there realizing that everything you thought you understood about this story was wrong, hit that like button right now, because we're about to talk about the lesson that changed not just Frank Lucas, but the entire power structure of Harlem for the next decade. 3 days after that basement meeting, the Corsini family tried to move into Harlem anyway. Not the whole family, just a crew. 8 guys with guns and attitude, figuring that with Bumpy dying and Frank compromised, the territory was up for grabs. They lasted 48 hours. Not because Bumpy killed them, he didn't touch them. Not because Frank stopped them, he was still putting himself back together, one broken piece at a time. They failed because word spread through Harlem like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson protected Frank Lucas, even after betrayal, even after everything. And if Bumpy Johnson forgave betrayal, if he protected his people even when they tried to destroy him, then trying. To move into Harlem wasn't just bad business, it was suicidal. The Corsinis retreated, quietly, without declaration or excuse. They just stopped trying, because they finally understood something that took Frank Lucas years to learn. You don't beat Bumpy Johnson by being stronger. You can't beat him by being smarter. You can't even beat him by being right. You beat him by being him. And there was only ever one of him. Frank Lucas went on to build an empire after Bumpy died, became a legend in his own right, made millions, changed the game. All of that is true, but he never forgot that basement, never forgot the feeling of standing there with an empty gun pointed at his chest, realizing that every choice he'd made for months had been predicted, accounted for, and used as a teaching tool by a man who loved him enough to let him fail. Years later, when Frank was training his own crew, someone asked him, "What's the most important lesson Bumpy Johnson ever taught?" "You?" Frank thought about that question for a long time. "He taught me that real power isn't about what you can take," he finally said. "It's about what you can give up and still be standing." He could have killed me, should have killed me. I betrayed him, worked with his enemies, put everything he built at risk. But instead of taking my life, he gave me a lesson. And that lesson, the humiliation, the fear, the realization that I'd been played from the start, that lesson was worth more than my life would have been. The truth is this: Bumpy Johnson didn't just run Harlem. He was Harlem. The good parts and the bad parts, the violence and the protection, the fear and the love. And when he died, cancer finally taking what bullets never could, Harlem felt it. The whole city felt it. Because men like Bumpy Johnson don't just leave a vacuum. They leave a lesson, a standard, a reminder that power without wisdom is just violence, and violence without purpose is just waste. Frank. Lucas learned that lesson in a basement with an empty gun. The rest of Harlem learned it at his funeral, when 15,000 people lined the streets to say goodbye to a criminal who never apologized for what he was but somehow managed to mean something more than his crimes. So here's the final question, the one I want you thinking about long after this video ends. What's more valuable, the power to destroy your enemies, or the wisdom to turn them back into allies? Because that answer determines whether you're just another player, or whether you become the game itself. And if you thought that story was complex, if you're sitting there realizing that everything you understand about loyalty, betrayal, and power just got turned upside down, then you need to hear about the one move Bumpy Johnson made that even Frank Lucas never saw coming. A play so perfect, so brutal, so absolutely genius that it redefined organized crime in New York for the next 30 years. I'm talking about the Castellano job, the one that made 5 families sit down and rewrite their entire playbook. That story drops next week, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Subscribe now, because what you just watched was chess. What's coming next is 4-dimensional warfare, and you're not ready. I'll see you in the next one.